Hello, my name is Tilika Jain, and today I'm here with Ms. Laurence Tubiana, who is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation and was a key architect of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So my first question is related to COP23, the Conference of the Parties that occurred in Germany last year. One of the most relevant but divisive debates at the conference was over the issue of loss and compensation, loss and damages, or the notion that poorer countries should be paid compensation for the costs incurred by climate change. So what are your opinions on this notion?
Of course, this loss and damages issue is a very contentious issue, mainly because it has a sort of a base of a legal, in a way, dimension where countries, the poor countries, in particular the low territories like small islands, would be entitled to that in a way that the government could be liable, the polluters could be liable. So in a way that dimension is really very contentious, even if it's unfair. They should be compensated in a way, or people who can't stay where they live, they have to migrate, which is the case of some of the Pacific Islands, for example, or would be the case for the Caribbean Islands in the future. We should have a collective solidarity around that. So I think unfortunately, because of the sensitivity, in particular of the US position on that, and but many other rich countries, we are not there. But in a way, it would be logical to try to support the countries that has to bear the brunt, the burden of really moving or having to adapt at a high cost. If not, we will have millions of migrants coming to the countries where less affected. So I think it's really, even if I understand it's very difficult in the short term, we should compare the cost of receiving millions of refugees by the way to try to help countries to adapt. So in the future, I don't think there will be a lot of question to do that. We will have to do that.
Right, I completely agree. However, at the conference, many countries such as Australia claim that not every natural disaster is caused by climate change. And the key discussions regarding sources of funding were postponed to the next conference. So how do you think this gap between these countries can be bridged about this issue?
I think the problem of the public funding in general, of course, and the global dimension of ODA is still there. And countries are, of course, not willing to really be as engaged as they should be. And on the other side, we don't have any global mechanism of taxation, for example, to raise the resources. That would really be logical. If we would have a global carbon tax, that would make a lot of sense to transfer a good part of this to the countries that are suffering most. So I think, again, we are not there, but on the other side, we should see that the international transfers that are still taking place, and it's about 100 million a year, and that will be around that billion a year. I think they should be really having a climate focus, that we should support the activities that make countries more resilient or more clean or more sustainable. And that's not still the case. There is a very interesting movement there where you see that all the development banks, for example, the multilateral development banks are engaged in doing that. If we have the bilateral agencies that are providing this aid, we do that. It's the governments themselves influence the financing in that direction. I think that will, in a way, be the way to solve the problem. You can't just think that all the investment has to be public. That will not be the case. But if the government's money help the private sector to come in a sustainable way, that can make these countries much more sustainable. But it's a totally different logic. I think we are beginning to be there. Again, not thinking that the public funding will make it all, but yes, pushing for it. I think we should not abandon the idea that one day we will need a global tax system to tackle these global externalities.
And so if the funding for this tax, like for a portion of it, went to these countries, which countries do you think would be qualified to being taxed? Like, how do you demarcate which countries are being taxed, or is it like a global tax on all countries?
Of course, again, to be realistic, we will not have a global carbon tax, for example. But you may imagine that many countries implement that tax at home, and that they could engage themselves in transferring at least even a small part of it to more impacted countries.
Right.
So that's the way I would say it. Not, of course, a global one, because still we see how we are lagging behind any global tax system. But that could be the way.
Right, so if there was maybe like a public way of transferring the carbon tax from each country and maybe in some way sending it to these countries. Right. So another potential solution that was explored at the conference was that of insurance. And so the Inci Resilience Global Partnership aims to provide 400 million poor and vulnerable people with insurance. So what is your view on this potential solution?
I think insurance is super important because the way it's quite difficult to know the impact of climate change really is about vulnerability and a lot of climate instability, in particular in the case of agricultural production. So I think insurance would be part of the solution, or in case of extreme events, you see that in the poor countries, people have no insurance. Like look at what happened in Philippines this year, last year and the year before, or in the Caribbean, a lot of people didn't have any insurance, so they just lost everything. So I think that's really important. Now that most of the rich countries and citizens in the more wealthy countries have these mechanisms, so they at least get some protection. But at the same time, if we don't act very seriously against climate change, the insurance mechanism will not make it. I'm sure you know that most of the insurance companies last year, when they compare their losses, what are really directly impacted by, correlated with climate events, it's really huge amounts. And you can't just pay more and more for insurance just to be protected. At some point in time, insurance company would not afford to do it. So I think the real response is really in being very strong on decarbonizing the global economy.
Right. So, so these conferences are like one of the primary hotspots of like coming up with potential solutions, and insurance was one of the solutions proposed. But do you think that there's not being done enough to address long-term issues like ocean acidification, rising sea levels, the overuse of common access resources like the oceans? Do you think that at these conferences people are not focusing that much on the long-term effects of climate change?
I agree on that. I haven't had time in the conference itself to address this long-term perspective, which for me it's absolutely essential. And not only because of the climate change dimension, which in a way we see sometimes too simply into carbon emissions, because we don't see the connection between biodiversity and of course it's about a system, an economic system also, as you know, has really a huge ecological footprint. And the ocean is, of course, the best example of that, with acidification from climate change, but plastics and destruction of coral reefs, and, of course, overfishing. It's not one issue. It's, of course, unfortunately, a global set of issues. So I do think that these conferences are useful in a way, but still we are not connecting the different problems. And sometimes we may have solutions that have negative impacts. For example, geoengineering. A number of countries or experts are thinking about why, if we can't just reduce emission because it's too difficult, which in reality is not that true, they think we could find a solution in modifying the climate. And one of the solutions is to get the ocean able to absorb more carbon, which is crazy because that, of course, has huge biological consequences. And so I think that is really the problem of now, really to put climate change in a broader discussion that really connect with the ecological footprint and see how we can develop economic systems that really reduce enormously this footprint. And I think it's possible. We have just 3 centuries or 2 centuries and a half doing it. We could do differently. So.
Yeah, you did speak a lot about optimism and pessimism in your speech, and yeah, that was extremely interesting. So you've also previously commented on France's dependency on nuclear power, stating that by reducing it, they could expand more on other renewable energies, and which is something that they might be lagging behind in. So what is your opinion on the development at COP23, where France declared that it would not honor the 2025 nuclear energy target of reducing the share of nuclear power down to 50%?
I think there is, of course, an ongoing debate on France on this nuclear industry. The actual government, in particular the president, I think, is thinking that nuclear is still a very big solution for France, and that its horizon of 2025 was too short to reduce the role of nuclear in the production of electricity. Well, I think it's very important to have milestones, so I think it's really important to have a diversification of the electricity production in France. We are lagging behind renewable, maybe because we didn't have so much incentive, because we have just enough electricity already. So I think that's important to, again, the electricity in France, when you look back at the 1940s, we used hydro, we use oil, we use coal. So now we use nuclear. So there is no fatality in having one technology. So again, I think it was, of course, a strong message from the French president to say we are confident that nuclear is still an option, and many countries are thinking it. But I think it's really vital for France to diversify.
And do you see that happening in the foreseeable future? Do you think France is moving to a path where it is going to reduce its dependency on nuclear and expand into renewables?
I see, yeah, because that's a very strong demand of the society, and that will happen.
Okay, so now my last question is just in general about the repercussions of the Paris Climate Agreement. So you did speak a lot about positive changes in the financial sector, in technology, transport, energy sector in your speech. So like now, more than 2 years later, do you think that climate change talks are going in the right direction after the Paris Climate Agreement? And what tangible results have actually been made since the signing of the agreement?
First, after the 2015, the question mark is implementation. No much talks, no. We have still something to finalize and some rules to finalize. As you mentioned, on loss and damages or transparency. This should be done this year, this year in Poland, finalizing this discussion. I think the big challenge is when we will be in 2020 and when countries have to confirm or to improve their national determined contribution, meaning their national commitments. That will be the moment of importance. And of course, and fortunately, we don't have a very progressive US government at that time. And by 2020, that will not be solved, in whatever direction. And hopefully, I hope we will have a government that is more responsible. So I would not say that the talks is they are important, and we have to finalize, but the more important is the sense that we can do much better than what we commit by 2050 in terms of national contribution. And that's why I insist so much on the cities, on the states, on the companies, on the investors' commitment, because that will change the mindset of the government by 2020.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights. It was a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you.